This is Jacqueline Luqman with the Real News Network. In today's turbulent social landscape, protests are a near constant across the country and the world, challenging the status quo over the proliferation of dangerous pipelines, discriminatory government policies, never-ending war, or greed-fueled corruption. People may be wondering, amidst all of this upheaval, what they would be willing to do, how far they would be willing to go to stand for what they believe in. Well, my guest today, Emily L. Quint Freeman, who is the author of the new memoir, Failure to Appear, Resistance, Loss, and Identity, has answered that question. And she's here to talk with me about the price she paid for standing up for what she believed in, and also about what she gained throughout that struggle. Emily, thanks so much for joining me.
Glad to be on the call.
Now, before we get into your activism, which is a big part of your story, you faced personal challenges on your path to self-discovery and acknowledgement. And I think it was, for me, from reading your memoir, it was your first act of courage. And I think it was a very courageous act. So would you tell us about what I consider that first act of bravery, how your parents responded to it?
Well, standing up for your sexual truth is difficult at any age. And in my case, I knew I was different and knew I was a lover of women rather than men in high school, but I didn't do anything about it at the time. But when I got to college, I did fall in love with a woman. And I told my parents at the end of my sophomore year that that was the case and that I wanted to spend the summer with her. I knew that I really risked everything. As it turned out, it was a call with my father that changed the course of my life. They decided not only to disown me, but also deny me any financial assistance to finish UC Berkeley. And I guess they figured in a week I'd cave in and fall for some boy, but I didn't. I worked my way through school, earning even better grades, and graduated with honors. But it took a lot, and it left me on my own without financial support. But it's that kind of moment of courage in your life that sets the tone for what's to follow.
Yeah, that is such a good segue to what happened next in your life, because it's without your parents' financial support that you continued school, you graduated from college, and then you became involved in the anti-war movement in a very direct way pretty quickly. So how did that happen? How did that transition happen between graduating from college and becoming involved in direct action in the anti-war movement?
Okay. I was already very aware and very engaged in the peace movement and civil rights on campus. I followed very closely what was going on in Vietnam. And after I graduated, I left with a bunch of other kids to spend a summer in Chicago organizing against the war. I ended up working for the American Friends Service Committee as a draft counselor. And there I really learned how this war was affecting poor and minority men in particular, and how unfair the draft was. That engagement with the Quakers led to a secret meeting, if you will, with Father Phil Berrigan, where he had proposed that we would, in Chicago, mirror an action that had happened a year ago in Catonsville, Maryland. So in 1968, he and 7 others burned a couple hundred files in Catonsville, Maryland as a protest. But in Chicago, he proposed that we would actually do something on a much larger scale, tying racism and war together. To me, that idea, participating in it, was a lot more directly to the suffering and the inhumanity and the crime of this war than marching and protests and all the things that I'd done before. It also spoke to my nonviolent ideals. So that is why I agreed to participate in that action.
And, it's interesting because there's a quote at the beginning of chapter 2 of your book that's from a 1969 press statement of the group Chicago Draft Action. And it reads, as white Americans, we bear a special responsibility with regard to the selective service system and the war machine it feeds. In our elimination of part of the death dealing and oppressive system, we make the prelude to the creation of life and freedom. That is a very profound quote to me. But can you explain for our viewers a little bit more in depth what it means to you and why you included it in your book in particular?
Yeah, it's a two-prong idea. First side of it is that the selective service system, or the draft, wasn't selective or even-handed. It allowed people like Donald Trump to get out on a bone spur, and white kids in the majority, if you will, get college deferments. Too many poor and minority men ended up in the infantry and in a paddy field and dying in Vietnam. In other words,
Yes.
it isn't a war that everyone volunteered for, or that minority men really had a fair shake at. They couldn't really get out on the typical deferments, and it was very difficult for a person of color to successfully file as a conscientious objector. That was number one. Number two, I guess Muhammad Ali said this best. I think when he refused induction in the Army, he said, and I'm just paraphrasing, why should I go all the way over the Pacific Ocean to a foreign country and kill brown people when in fact I'm treated like a dog at home, never given justice, never given opportunity in Louisville? The point is really about social justice here. And he said it very powerfully when he refused and actually was stripped of his title rather than go and be inducted into the military. So I think those two thoughts were very much in our mind when we wrote that press statement. And I think that statement still speaks today.
It really does. It's so profound today. And I'm going to ask you about the connection to your activism then and the struggles of many people today in fighting for peace. But I want to ask you specifically, so the reason this particular location was chosen for this action was in order to make a statement about the connection to race, that the unfairness of the selective service, or what we know as the draft, really was. How did that play out? What was the significance of this location that this action was chosen for?
Well, it was absolutely critical to our message. And rather than choosing a draft board in a white suburb, we decided to head to a Chicago South Side, which was really a draft board complex of a number of boards together in one location. We decided to pick a center, which really was the heart of the Black community on the South Side of Chicago and Hispanic community, to make a statement. Rather, as I said, rather than going up to a rich suburb like Winnetka in Illinois or some other location, we wanted to really pick something that really relayed our message, that the two are inexorably linked together. Not only was the war hitting hard at minority and poor working people, but also the fact that these very people we sent to fight, involuntarily, I might add, are also denied justice and economic opportunity at home. So the setting of what we did was absolutely critical. It also allowed us to do something on a much larger scale. Whereas Canesville was a couple of hundred files, we destroyed over 40,000.
You and your comrades destroyed over 40,000 draft files.
Absolutely. And in the day, there were no computers. So the only records they had were the ledgers, the files that were stored in that office. So my deepest hope, if you will, more than 50 years later, is that those men never went to Vietnam.
I mean, people might ask themselves, what would they do or how far would they go to stand up for their beliefs you certainly went farther than many people, I would argue, even today would go. A lot of people won't even come out for protests against pipelines or against police brutality, but you and your comrades directly impacted the lives of at least 40,000 poor Black men from the South Side of Chicago, and maybe beyond, because those, you said that that was a complex of selective service offices. So, goodness gracious. So, Emily, I have to ask you now.
And if you think about their
Oh,
children and their grandchildren and their families,
absolutely.
you know, the rock that we dropped in the pool that sent those ripples
Oh
affected a
my
lot more
gosh.
than just that. And the intent here was to save lives. Those pieces of paper represented lives.
40,000 lives, and all of the lives that they have created and have touched since. That's absolutely amazing to me. But I have to ask you at this point, as much of a benefit to those 40,000 men that your actions were, you paid a pretty high price for those actions, didn't you? Now, I don't want you to give away everything, because we want people to buy the book, because it really is a fabulous read into your journey. But can you give us just a brief highlight of the price you paid for committing this action?
Well, I knew we would go to jail, and indeed we were in jail after the action. But the Catonsville group a year before were sentenced to 1 to 2 years. And I think they got out early, if you will, for time served. But in our case, they threw the book at us, not only for the scale of the action itself and the audacity of it, but we entered into a different world from the action in 1969 to what happened in 1970. If you think about 1970, in Chicago, after the sort of, I call it a police riot at the Democratic National Convention, our,
Absolutely.
our trial began a few days after Kent State students were killed, murdered by the National Guard in a peaceful protest against the war. We entered into a country that was polarized and violent and angry. And the judge basically would not allow us to speak about our motives behind the action, and intended for one priest and I, who were the leaders of this group, to be thrown in jail for a long period of time. I was absolutely alone at the time, no family to support me at my trial.
Yes.
And I made a certain decision at the time, which turned out to be quite fateful. I had some very hard time at the Cook County Jail, and I decided near the end of the federal trial to flee. And what happened is described in this book quite vividly, what the next 19 years of my life was like and what I ultimately did to return. But I would say to you that my whole life has been shaped by this. And I haven't had a moment of regret for the action itself. The fact that I fled certainly was not well conceived, and it had a fateful consequence to me of a very hard life. But I learned a lot in this process, but I came out of it in the other end, I think, still that kid of 24 years old who believed in peace and social justice. That hasn't changed in all these years.
Now, I don't want to ask you about anything that happened after you fled, because, like I said, I want people to buy this book and to read it and to understand that, yes, sometimes we do have to pay a price to stand up for the things we believe in. And even though that price can be high sometimes, what we gain in the end is even greater. And you're still a peace activist, aren't you?
Yes, and social justice as well. I'm sort of very much engaged in things like immigrant rights and climate change and other things. I haven't become conservative in my later years at all. But I would say to you that speaking truth to power and having a conscience defines a person. And in my case, it's been a rich reward to be true to myself. I'm not saying other people to go out and burn draft files or whatever they decide to do, but to have a conscience and stand up and resist and persist will define and enrich your life rather than being defined, if you will, by a job or someone else's morals or standards. You feel like you've accomplished something in this world.
And I think that is a salient message for people today who are facing so much turmoil in this society and maybe wondering what they can do, wondering how far they're willing to go, and wondering how high of a price they are willing to pay. We're certainly not giving anyone instructions on what to do, but we are absolutely here advocating that people should stand up for what they believe in and in the face of these continuing struggles. So I'm going to leave this right here. I intend for this to be a cliffhanger because I want people to buy your book, Emily. Emily L. Quint Freeman, thank you so much for joining me today to give us just a taste, a teaser of your memoir.
Thank you for asking me.
And Emily L. Quint Freeman's memoir is Failure to Appear: Resistance, Loss, and Identity. Please buy her book. Oh, Emily, when will the book be released and where will people be able to obtain it?
It's actually going to be released March 1st for Women's History Month. You can buy it on Amazon, independent bookstores, or Barnes & Noble.
This is fabulous. Always resist, ladies and gentlemen. We struggle and we struggle to win. This is Jacqueline Luqman with the Real News Network in Washington, D.C.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.